Rand is, as he puts it, a recovering aerospace engineer. But he has been a pioneer in pushing for the private road to space, the entrepreneurial road to space. His point has been more than the technical form. It is the, if you will, the organizational or political form in which space exploration and development occurs that will be enabling or disabling. So without further ado, Rand Simberg.
Thanks, Bob. Good morning. This talk is, there's a little bit of a plug. This talk is partly based on part of a very long essay that's about to be published in the New Atlantis that I wrote. And I believe that Bob has a piece in that issue as well. It's going to be kind of a sort of space issue. And so it'll be the August issue of that quarterly on technology and policy. I want to start with a little poll. How many here do not want to see humans go to Mars? Okay, that's not a shocking response from this crowd. How many people want to go to Mars, personally? Looks like about, mostly, yeah. How many people want to live on Mars? Looks like mostly the same people. They just don't want to visit, they want to go. How many people want to raise a family on Mars? Okay, now we're kind of narrowing things down, but you are the people that this talk is about. And I should note the irony of this, because I personally do not give a rat's patoot about Mars. But I do care about seeing large numbers of people living off the planet and being able to go live wherever they want to go. And if you're interested in settling Mars, which if you're raising a family, almost by definition, that's what you're doing, right? Property rights are going to be very, very important. And it's a very problematic situation right now. So I want to start by talking about visions of space. And Rick Tumlinson talks about this. I don't know if I saw he was on the program. I don't know if he spoke the other night or not. But Rick talks about 3 visions of space. He talks about the Saganian, Carl Sagan mission, the what he calls von Brownian mission, what I call Apolloism, and the O'Neillian vision. And the Sagan vision is Earth is a beautiful, or space is a beautiful jewel, look but don't touch. Even though Carl kind of backed off on that later, he decided, yeah, it's okay at least to send humans out to explore it. The von Brownian vision, or Apolloism, is the notion that only governments can do space, and they will be the vanguard of humanity into space. Okay, and the O'Neillian vision is thousands, millions of people living and working in space, and this is the Jeff Bezos vision as well. So I want to tell a little story. You've probably heard these debates before. I was up in Seattle last November, I think, for a conference that put on by The Economist. And so they sponsored one of these debates, which you always hear, should we go to the moon? Should we go to Mars and other places? Or should we not send people anywhere at all? And these debates always infuriate me, because it's a false choice based on a false premise. Because the question is, who is the we that we're talking about here? It assumes that there's some collective societal decision that we have to choose this planet or that planet, or not to go at all. And so I made that point, when they take Q&A, because the answer is some of us are going to go to Moon, some of us are going to go to Mars, some of us are going to go to Ceres, some of us, once they get out of the gravity well, they're not going to want to go back down into another one. And some people, in fact, most people, are not going to go anywhere, because most people are homebodies, and people who want to live on other planets are mutant weirdos. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but honestly, they are. But the other thing was that in arguing that we wouldn't go anywhere, sometimes the argument is made, well, we haven't even, built ocean colonies, on the seabed. Why would we do space? Okay, there's lots of reasons that's a dumb argument. But the other one they use is we haven't settled Antarctica. We have some research stations there, but nobody's, going there and living and raising families. And at this point, like steam's coming out of my ears. And Jeff Grayson is sitting next to me, and so he stands up and says, there's a reason that we haven't settled Antarctica. It's because people who live there can't own the land, they can't work the land, they cannot borrow against the land, they cannot pass the land on to their children, and the reason for that is because of the Antarctic Treaty. And so now we come to the problem with space. Because the Outer Space Treaty was in fact based on the Antarctic Treaty. So it essentially, at the time it was passed, 60 years ago, or 50 years ago, 51 now, space was just envisioned as the province of governments. And nobody imagined people were actually going to be going out there and doing stuff on their own. So it was modeled on Antarctica, where it was just a realm of science and exploration. Fortunately, it's now 6 decades since we've been doing space stuff, a little over. And it's becoming finally acceptable to talk about space settlements in polite company. But unfortunately, the policy has not yet caught up with that. But it's starting to. And as I say, the Outer Space Treaty was perfectly compatible with the Sagan vision and with the von Brownian approach. It is completely incompatible with the O'Neill approach, or at least with the notion that people are going to be living on other planets. But change is on the way, in fact, with the new administration. Even though they've refocused on the moon, there is recognition of the importance of ability to use the resources there, not just there, but in space in general. And so there's actually a sea change. Jim Bridenstine the new NASA administrator, gave a speech. He's been talking about things like, reuse. He said, we're not going to go back to the moon unless we reuse stuff. And same thing would apply to Mars. And he says we need to use extraterrestrial resources, we need to do space assembly, we need to do all these, we need CubeSats, see what we can do with those. So this is he's probably the most openly visionary NASA administrator we've ever had. Maybe Tom Paine was to that degree, but he's saying the kinds of things that certainly Charlie Bolden would never have said. So that's good news. The other good news is that we've reestablished a Space Council. It's nominally headed by Mike Pence, just because there's a tradition of vice presidents being in charge of space going all the way back to LBJ. But the person who's actually running the Space Council is Professor Scott Pace from the LA School at George Washington University. And I personally have known Scott. He's been a colleague and a friend for almost 40 years. So that was a good choice. And he is, so he is very visionary as well. He was a member of the L5 Society, and he's been in fact, he was, very heavily involved with it. And the same thing when it became the National Space Society. I can't remember what roles he played, but he had some leadership positions there. So he gets it. The space science community is starting to figure this out. I was at the Lunar Science for Land Missions workshop up at Ames in January. And the people there are figuring out that, they've got to be doing more than just pure science and understanding the origin of the moon. They need to figure out how can we actually utilize the resources there to enable other stuff, including more exploration. And Blue Origin was there. They're recognizing that they may get there by means other than rides on NASA. So all this stuff is good. In December, at the Galloway Space Law Symposium in DC, Scott gave a speech that contains hints of what the future of space policy may hold. And he laid out 6 key policy goals. First, that U.S. policy will prioritize the interests of the United States and its friends. The United States will be the most friendly jurisdiction for private sector participation and innovation in space. The U.S. government will use legal and diplomatic means to create a stable and peaceful environment for both government and commercial space activities. I'm paraphrasing, by the way. He is more extensive than that. Fourth, the private sector must have confidence that it will be able to profit from capital investments made in space activities and infrastructure. Fifth, we need to resolve questions and ambiguities in the existing treaty structure about property ownership and rights. So clearly the administration this is really the first administration that's thought about this. And finally, there's a need to develop international norms through both bottom-up best practices with partners and top-down non-binding confidence-building measures without a need for changing existing treaties and arms agreements. Because he was dealing with the military issues as well, not just private space. So those are the 6 policy goals that he laid out. Now, a key element of the speech, and I'm going to actually quote this. It was a shot across the bow at some countries, such as Russia, with dramatic implications for the future of space development and settlement. He said, quote, outer space is not a global commons, nor the common heritage of mankind. It's not res communis, nor is it a public good. These concepts are not part of the Outer Space Treaty, and the United States has consistently taken the position that these ideas do not describe the legal status of outer space. Reference to these concepts is more distracting than it is helpful. To unlock the promise of space, to expand the economic sphere of human activity beyond the Earth, requires that we do not constrain ourselves with legal constructs that do not apply to space, end quote. So these are all international legal terms of art, res communis, common, this stuff. The Outer Space Treaty, to which we and all spacefaring nations are signatories, declares space activities, quote, the province of all mankind. That is, it's a region which all people who wish and can afford to participate, can participate. The 1979 Moon Agreement, to which no spacefaring nation has acceded, used the phrase common heritage of mankind, implying that it is a commons that must be shared. There are a lot of people that would still like the U.S. to sign on to that agreement. But it's worth noting that one reason space activists have fought against the Law of the Sea Treaty for years was that the Moon Treaty was modeled on it. And the Law of the Sea Treaty was to figure out how do you apportion the profits from seabed mining, basically. And one of the reasons we haven't done much seabed mining is because of the Law of the Sea Treaty, even though we have not, we never have ratified it. But it would be a terrible precedent for the ability to mine space resources if we were to sign on to the Moon Agreement. So let's talk about the importance of property rights for a minute. Hernando de Soto is, I think he still is, a Peruvian, I think he's still alive, Peruvian economist. If he is, he's still an economist. He's a Peruvian economist who wrote a book that I just remember the name of right now, but it was about the differences in the economies of Anglo-America, that is Canada and the U.S., and Latin America, which is everything below Canada and the U.S., to first order. Brazil's a little different because it's Portuguese, but it's still basically the same idea. And he pointed out that a lot of this poor economic growth and income inequality of Latin America was a result of the fact of how, basically the Spanish legal system that it established. It was kind of a feudal system. Whereas North America, Anglo-America, was founded, with the exception of Louisiana and Quebec, based on English common law. And that included titled property with deeds that was registered and that the government would support. So Latin America didn't have this, Anglo-America did, and it made a huge difference in terms of industrial growth and wealth. And this English common law tradition goes all back to medieval times, all the way back to the Domesday Book, which kind of recorded who lived where and who owned what. So that's what we have today in this country. You know, you buy a house, you get a deed, you own the property that it's on, you have the mineral rights to it, and so on. So we need to remove these ambiguities about property rights for space settlements. Now, there's not going to be a legal issue if somebody goes out and builds an O'Neill colony, because this outer space treaty doesn't really apply to that. You can, you know, it's an artificial structure, and you probably would just like own a condo in it or something, right? But if you're on a planetary body, a celestial body, which by the way is not defined anywhere, so that makes things even more interesting. But clearly, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that the moon is a celestial body and Mars is a celestial body, and right now, it's difficult under many interpretations of the Outer Space Treaty to actually own property on a planet. So a lot of people argue, and not people per se, but lawyers argue. Hey, I kid. I've got a lot of friends who are lawyers. So many of my now former friends claim that our rights are either insecure under or outright prohibited by two articles in the OST. The first one, Article 2, prohibits national appropriation by claim of sovereignty by means of use or occupation or by any other means. That's a quote. Article 6 demands continuing supervision by governments of non-governmental activities. So the argument is that in order to enforce a property right, a state must have sovereignty over the land on which the property lies, which is prohibited by Article 2. And if a private individual tried to make a property claim and this government were to recognize it, even if it weren't going to defend it, if it merely recognized it, it wouldn't be in keeping with its duty as a state's party to the treaty to properly, continually supervise its non-governmental individual or corporate persons. So, that's the issue. There's another problem with the treaty in terms of settlement, which is Article 9, which requires that states exploring celestial bodies must, quote, avoid their harmful contamination and also adverse changes in the environment of the Earth resulting from the introduction of extraterrestrial matter. So, like the phrase celestial bodies, what counts as harmful or adverse is not defined, and read even liberally, you'd think these terms could be prohibited to any meaningful human settlement of planets or moons, or the use on Earth of resources mined from them. So, Scott Pace is well aware of these longstanding issues, and that's why he had made that speech at Galloway. His language about being able to be friendly to the private sector, being able to profit from investment, it's indicative, I think, of a pivot of this new administration from the Apolloistic and Saganian models to a more O'Neillian one that envisions people, Americans and others, living and working in space for their own private purposes. So this really is a huge change in attitude if you've been following space policy for a few decades. It's a really big difference in the way the federal government is looking at this stuff. And it's a good thing. So about 10 years ago, John Marburger, the late John Marburger, he was George W. Bush's science advisor, gave a speech, I think at the Goddard Symposium, talking about expanding the economic sphere beyond the Earth. And so Scott's call does the same thing. It echoes that. And now it's not just a science advisor, but we have a space council, and he's the head of it, and he understands the levers of power in Washington. So I think we can expect good things to be happening in that regard. He gave a speech to the Hudson Institute a few weeks ago, 2 or 3 months ago, I guess, where he described the Outer Space Treaty as, quote, permissive with regard to the stated national objectives. Now, I would put it a different way, and this is what I've been talking about with various people, including other countries. I was in Vienna at the legal subcommittee meeting in April, and I received a fairly friendly reception from many people to this, but the idea of mine is to make the solar system safe for traditional English common law, while at the same time not requiring it that it be universally applied. If people want to do something different in some places, that's fine. But but we believe that we should extend this system that works very well here out into space, out into the solar system. So I think one of the things that Scott is thinking about, and I've actually discussed it with him, and I've also talked to Gabriel Swinney, who is our representative to Copious, specifically with regard to space resources, is to do multilateral agreements. And in fact, just this past week, Gabriel tweeted, space resources are the most important medium-term issue that we have. And that was his personal opinion, but it's pretty clear that the, you know, this government, this administration is going to be very friendly, and we've even passed legislation. Luxembourg has passed national legislation last year, and we passed some similar one that says, yeah, we think our people can use space resources. And it's kind of important to really be pushing hard on this right now, because the Russian government announced last fall, that it actually wanted to outlaw the use of space resources, even though they're acting like they wanted to set up the regime of the Moon Agreement, even though they're not a signatory to it. So that's kind of weird. So anyway, my current plan under the current, or my proposal under the current circumstances, is to develop multilateral agreements, both within the Anglosphere, that is us, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, maybe South Africa if they don't go crazy, India, so all the places that already have English common law, but also anybody else who wants to join in, such as clearly Luxembourg is interested, and I've talked to them, and Japan, maybe Israel, maybe the UAE. You know, we're not going to say it's only an Anglosphere thing, but it clearly is an Anglosphere thing. And part of that would include probably getting Australia out of the Moon Agreement, because now that they have a space agency, they claim to want to do stuff in space. And they have mining companies, I'm sure, who are champing at the bit to get involved in the outer space mining. So we should, part of that agreement, probably get them to withdraw from the Moon Agreement, because the two treaties are fundamentally incompatible with each other. Professor Sergio Marchisio at the University of Rome has in fact argued this at Copious. It says you can be a signatory to the OST, or you can be a signatory to the Moon Agreement, but you can't be both. It's like saying, I like Christianity, but you know, Judaism's kind of cool too. I think I'll be both. You have to make a choice. Even though everybody who signed on to the Moon Agreement, all 18 countries, none of which has ever launched as much as a grapefruit into orbit, they're also signatories to the OST, but in my opinion, they should not be. So anyway, I would like to get Australia out, and I would also like to see this government, our government, not merely, Jimmy Carter signed the Moon Agreement, but the Senate never ratified it. I would like to see the administration actively repudiate it, just to make the point. So what would these multilateral agreements look like? I haven't drafted anything, but I think they'd be based on the following principles. First, as I just said, an understanding of the distinction between the province of all mankind language of the Outer Space Treaty versus common heritage of all mankind of the Moon Agreement, and how they're fundamentally philosophically incompatible with each other. Next, all states parties to these agreements or agreement will recognize property claims of individuals from any nation, including citizens not of those states parties, subject to certain conditions. And of course, those conditions are wherein lie the details that the devil's going to lie, trying to figure out what that is. But I would propose that we start with, we have stuff that's worked in history. The 1862 Homestead Act and the 1872 Mining Law could be useful models. Basically, what it's going to say is you have to inhabit the property for some designated period of time, and you have to improve it in some sense in order to gain the title. So to me, it would be legally absurd to say if we and these other countries not just us, not just the US, if all of these countries party to this agreement, will recognize the claim of not just our own citizens, but anybody, I don't see how that could possibly be called, logically be called a national appropriation under Article 2. Okay. I think it's important to distinguish between resources used in space for personal use, that is like basically living off the land, you know, life support, water, making oxygen, whatever. We need to distinguish between that and resources for commercial use. For example, you know, mining the moon for water and then selling propellant to Elon to send people to Mars. Okay, so those would be two distinctions, but they would both be allowed. But there's a third, the most important distinction is the use of space resources that are then brought and injected into the terrestrial economy. Because the latter is what the people who wanted to have the moon agreement were more concerned with, because the idea was that for bringing in massive amounts of platinum or whatever, then the countries whose basic economies, you know, these developing nations that live by extractive industries, you might plunge the cost so much that you damage their own prospects for growth. So the idea was to have some kind of mechanism by which they could be compensated for that. So you know, actually bringing resources from space into Earth and selling them on Earth, like everybody talks about the $1 trillion, you know, platinum asteroid or something, which is silly, but that's the kind of thing, you know, that we need to deal with in terms of how to placate the moon agreement supporters. And along the same lines, we have to recognize the utter impracticality of space resource utilization, quote, benefiting every nation on an equal basis without discrimination. Because that was the wording that a lot of people were using in the exchange of views in Vienna this past April. For example, the notion that the sale of liquid oxygen from the moon to Elon for a trip to Mars should somehow benefit Botswana is absurd. So one way we might think about dealing with this is if you actually do bring something in, maybe you could put a tariff on it, so you could set up some corrupt thing just to satisfy them that can then take those resources and you know, provide a development bank or something, you know, to allow other countries maybe to set up a space program. But that's the kind of thing we could talk about without actually setting up this regime of the moon treaty, moon agreement. Finally, I'd say that we have to have a permissive interpretation of Article 9 that doesn't preclude humans landing on Mars due to the need for planetary protection, while at the same time ensuring the preservation of heritage sites. You know, like on the moon. I don't know if Michelle Hanlon has an organization called For All Moonkind, and she's been promoting this. You know, how do we preserve the Apollo sites? Yeah, so we have to have something that tries to find that line between preserving historical things, but also allowing people, and in the future, maybe we have to allow urban renewal of some kind, but that's quite a ways off in the future. Finally, we have to recognize that this proposal will not be without controversy. There are many people, both inside and outside the U.S., who do not, in fact, share an expansive vision of humanity in space, and some who believe that humanity is sufficiently problematic that, you know, it's really kind of this cancer that evolved in this planet. It has to be confined to this planet and not be allowed to spread out into the solar system. But, you know, that's yet another battle we're going to have to wage. But if we base our new policies on these sorts of principles, I think after more than a century of dreams of massive human activity in space and visions, this goes back all the way to 1894, John Jacob Astor wrote a book, you know, about space colonization. I think with what's going on, if we have this policy in place and the new technologies and these wealthy new visionaries, will finally enable all the most expansive space visions that we've been having for so long. Any questions?
Yeah, questions. Okay, I'll bring the microphone over.
Here you go.
Rand, regarding Article 2, I think that one of the things we need to look at is the fact that the drafting of it was pretty bad, and the Earth is a celestial object, and therefore all of the precedent in the law of nations is that that res nullis is subject to national appropriation, and that the article has to be seen as just preposterous. I mean, that's it. Well, your thoughts on that?
Well, I should say it's, you know, when I first started this project, because I actually was being funded to actually start this project back in January, I poked around in D.C. and I talked to the State Department and I talked to Scott and I talked to Jim Muncie and other people, and I said, okay, well, you know, we want to make the Outer Space Treaty more friendly for space settlement. That was basically the goal of the project. And they say, okay, but we are not going to renegotiate the treaty. We are not that, you know, and that's why Scott gave that speech. He's basically saying, you know, you space lawyers can go pound sand. We're going to interpret the treaty the way I'm saying we're going to interpret the treaty. So it's a question of properly interpreting that badly written treaty, not trying to, because it would be a huge can of worms to renegotiate that. It would be the same thing that people worry about having a convention of the states, right? You don't know what's going to come out of that, and you know, Russia could cause all kinds of mischief if we start to renegotiate. So that was kind of taken off the table. It's just we're going to properly interpret that treaty.
Another question.
Could you explain how this applies to stateless people such as the Rohingya?
No. I don't think they're likely to be trying to go to space.
So Rand, so the people on the moon and Mars or elsewhere who are living there, if they, at a certain point, maybe 50, 60,000, whatever, if they were to establish their own constitution and choose their own government, elect their own government at that time, couldn't they define themselves as a new political entity that has not signed up to the Outer Space Treaty, and therefore they have property rights?
Sure.
But is that too late? We need property rights before that point.
We need property rights before that point, I think. Well, because it gets back to, and I wrote a paper on this, an issue analysis when I was at the head of Enterprise Institute about 6 years ago. It said the reason property rights are important, many reasons, but if you want, from an entrepreneurial standpoint, you have to have something you can borrow against. You know, if you want to raise money to develop land, you need to own the land, and you need to be able to say, okay, here's the title to the land, here's the deed, and we'll put this up against a loan. You know, so you can have a mortgage, and then you can build stuff, you can raise money. Without that, it's really, you don't have any collateral if you don't own the property.
Yeah. I like the 1987 Outer Space Treaty in that it did stop the militarization of outer space with satellites, as far as we know. It did stop a possible war, but I think the Outer Space Treaty needs to be improved. Needs to be stronger and better and more democratic. I can't think of any kind of international treaty that would have any meaning if it excluded over half of the entire world's population. Countries like China, India, the Philippines, Russia.
It doesn't. It does not.
And let me finish, please. So, and if we're in favor of an international treaty, that'll place tough international regulations and controls over what individuals do on Mars to make a profit. What kinds of elements would you like to see in that sort of treaty so that we don't have just a free-for-all where everyone can do their thing as long as they're trying to make money? I think we need to regulate that, because without any government international regulations, it will be a free-for-all. There could be wars, and they could really do some damage to the planet, and I'm worried about that. I don't want to see that. I want to see the scientific exploration of Mars and I don't want to see people doing any damage to that planet over territory or that's, I'm glad they don't have clean or unclean coal on Mars, because some people say, hey, let's get some coal from Mars. So what do you think about that anyway? An international, really international treaty.
Well, I'm not proposing any new, I'm proposing multilateral agreements. I don't know what damage Mars looks like. You know, I don't know what damaging a moon that's pocked with craters and getting new ones every day looks like. I think I would note that countries that operate under English common law don't tend to make war on each other. I think that we can make things work pretty well in space the way we, over time, have come to make things work pretty well here. So I guess if you want to draft up a treaty, you know, people will debate it and consider it and so on. And by the way, the Outer Space Treaty did not prevent the militarization of space. Space was militarized from day one, and it continues to be. Which is, there's all this nonsense that people don't talk about. Oh, the Space Force is going to cause a war. And well, no, Space Force is not creating militarization of space. It's responding to it. It's recognizing it. All the Outer Space Treaty prevents is weapons of mass destruction in orbit and military bases on other bodies. But it does not prevent the militarization of space because we have, you know, DOD has a bigger space budget than NASA does.
What's wrong with the current status of ambiguity? Large extractive companies are used to going into lawless places, semi-lawless places, extracting minerals and making money. Whatever major economic activities, you know, extracting water might be the first. All someone has to do is incorporate in Luxembourg in the U.S. and do what they want. And at some point, some government will come into existence. Well, what's wrong with what we have?
Well, I don't think there is an issue with resource utilization right now. I think there's a semi-consensus in the space legal community that if you go out and you mine water on the moon, you can use the water, you can sell the water, you could even, if you were so stupid, bring the water back to Earth and try and sell it here. And, you know, actually that might, maybe people would pay money for moon water. I don't know. But that's not the issue. That's not what really what my talk was about, because I don't think that's, because people have Russell brought back samples, we have Apollo samples, and we have a legal precedent for them being exchanged for tokens of value. So that's not a problem. The problem is owning land. That's what I'm trying to address, because we need that to sell.
Okay, we got another question here.
Practically speaking, realistically, seems like treaties can be made obsolete and irrelevant by a lack of enforcement. The Treaty of Versailles being a good example.
Yeah, no, and that ultimately will happen. I always like to say that in some sense the Outer Space Treaty, and particularly the Moon Agreement, are like the Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Pope basically said, I'm going to split the New World down this line, and Portugal gets this much, and Spain gets the rest. Okay, it didn't work out that way exactly.
Thank you for answering my question. But now,
but the question is not what are we doing 30 years from now. It's how do we, how do we deal with, if we want to go there now? How can we do that within the current international legal framework?
I was going to ask you a question about, the Pope's division of the world for Spain and Portugal in the context of, it's hard to rethink all this stuff. It's like trying to rethink terraforming, because we don't know the market or the resources or what's going to drive us to space economically. We're all kind of research people here. We have an idea and love about commercial use, but we don't have the thirst and the lust and the taste for going there. We don't have the sugar plantation problem, the sugar problem that Europeans had, the so-called spice trade. We haven't found the gold there yet that the Queen will hawk her jewels for to get.
Unfortunately, we haven't found brown people to subjugate, and we hope we won't.
That's a good thing. Thanks.
We have another couple questions over there. Before I go over there to get your questions, is John Mackins in the room? Is Mike Dunn in the room? Oh, Mike Dunn? Okay.
Hi, this is sort of a response to this question over there on who would you trust to negotiate a new treaty and create new regulations that do not make it impossible for people interested in harvesting resources for commercial use to make a profit for their activities?
Well, right now, I would trust our current State Department, frankly, because you know I've been talking to them, and they are very much in favor of it.
We got one last question, and I have our next speaker ready to start.
Why would Russia be against the utilization of space resources? It seems like they have just as much to gain as anybody else. And also, what is China's position on all this?
When Russia came out with that announcement last year, all of us were scratching our heads. And I think probably even some of the Russian space companies were saying, WTF? Because don't ask me what motivates Putin. As far as China, I'm sure that they want to do this. You know, and interesting. I've never been very concerned about China, actually, but I'm starting to a little bit because now they're kind of unleashing their own private sector on space. But I'm sure they wouldn't be unamenable, probably, to, I'm sure they want to use those resources, too. So we'll see if we start to do these negotiations, these multilateral agreements, we'll see if China wants to play.
Okay, that concludes the talk here.